Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Today's episode of the Social Work Podcast is an exploration of the similarities and differences between social work in the United Kingdom and the United States. In order to get a little bit of insight into what social work in the UK is like, I spoke with David Niven, the former national chair of the British Association of Social Workers. He has over 30 years of national and international experience in the field of social welfare and is recognized as an independent expert on matters of child protection and parenting. He's also the founder and host of the Social World Podcast, which you can find at socialworldpodcast.com. David and I talked about some of the similarities and differences between social work education and practice in the United States and the United Kingdom. There are a lot of similarities. One of the differences, though, that I found most interesting and that you'll hear more about in this episode is that in the United Kingdom, there is a very, very close relationship between social workers that work in child and family services and child protection, whereas in the United States, child welfare and social work are distinct entities. And now, without further ado, on to episode 85 of the Social Work Podcast, Similarities and Differences Between Social Work in the United States and the United Kingdom, an interview with David Niven. All right, David, thanks so much for being here on the Social Work Podcast and talking with us today. What is the difference between social work in the UK and social work in the United States?
Well, I mean, I hope in terms of actual the commitment, not a lot, but I suppose in terms of the academic journey, a little bit. In the UK, in order to become a social worker at a basic level, you've got to have a degree in social work at a UK university, and that takes 3 years. And you come out of that with a Bachelor of Arts or whatever degree in social work. But postgraduate stuff is now taking off in terms of, as I said, the 40 universities that offer the degree in a postgraduate level, which means that you do a year or two as extra, plus at least a year of assessed practice when you just after qualification.
So is that sort of like the master's in social work that we have in the United States?
Yeah, that would be the master's, although I think we call things slightly differently. I believe that the master's in the States is the equivalent to the bachelor degree in this country. That's my understanding. How long does the American one take? Is it 3 years?
So the way that it works for us is that you enter university, which I understand around the rest of the world they call it uni, but we don't. We just call it going to college or going to university. So you start out in college, and at some point around maybe 2 years in, you declare a major, and you say, I want to be a social work major. And then you have 2 years of coursework, you do an internship, and then you can go on and get a master's degree, which is another 2 years of full-time work. It's the terminal practice degree for us in the United States.
It's not much different then, really. In this country, what you've got to do is you're not allowed to go straight from high school to university. You've got to have at least 2 years of a gap where you pick up just some practical experience, life experience, etc. Then you can go to do the 3-year course that I mentioned.
I think that's really interesting. We don't have anything like that in the United States. Do you think that experience changes what students come into when they decide to do social work in the UK? And do you think it changes how they practice once they get out?
Well, I think it does, but I think quite honestly, the thing is you have to say, I hope so. It's a question of growing up a little bit more, a question of maturing a little bit more, because social work, as you know, and all our American colleagues would agree with you, that it's a very difficult and very stressful occupation. And although it's very rewarding, it does require a degree of strong character and a degree of life experience. And therefore, our feeling in this country is that if we can get that, if we can encourage a little bit more of that, and people actually, it helps people choose. It also, to be quite frank, it weeds some people out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's one of the things that we we struggle with here in the United States because we have this program called advanced standing. If you have a bachelor's degree in social work, there are many schools which say your last year at university counts towards the first year of your master's degree, and so you basically only have to go for a year. So then you have students that are 23 years old that have a master's degree in social work, right, the terminal practice degree, but they have no, outside of their internships, they have no lived experience as a professional.
No, I mean, I remember this, and you must too at the beginning when you first practiced, that one of the common challenges from families were, well, look, you want me to take advice from somebody that's still wet behind the ears. You want me to take advice from somebody that hasn't experienced life, really. Come on, surely surely that's not right. You can't know about what it is to have teenage kids. You can't know to what it means to have this, that, and the next thing. And although in many cases, you've got to say, well, that's not necessarily always true, it did sort of give an extra hurdle to jump over.
What we tell students is, that moment is actually a social work moment, right? That's when you say, it sounds like you are concerned that I am not going to be able to help you, and I would love to be able to talk about that more.
I think the crucial thing for me is, if I could just tell you a little anecdote that I heard once and this summed it up to me. It was in court, and a judge was listening very sort of carefully, almost falling asleep actually, to the summing up of a particular lawyer in a case who was speaking in mitigation for his client. And at the end of about 3/4 of an hour presentation, the judge turned to the lawyer and said, well, look, thanks very much, Mr. whatever his name was, but I must admit, I'm absolutely none the wiser. And the lawyer, quick as a flash, turned back to him and took his life in his hands, mind you, but turned back to him and said, well, that's as well may be, my lord, but I hope you're better informed. And that's the crucial thing for me, is the difference between information and wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And that extra bit of time might just give that little bit of wisdom.
In the United States, there's a difference between social work and child welfare.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the stats are between 10 to maybe 30% of people who work in child welfare have social work degrees, but the vast majority do not. And so they're not social workers. And yet there's a lot of confusion in the media, and in fact among some social workers, about the difference between child welfare and social work. Is there a distinction in the UK between child welfare work and social work?
I think the answer is sometimes, but perhaps not so acutely. The number of social workers who work in child protection are always qualified.
Oh, interesting. So when I say child welfare, I was actually talking about child protective services, where there are reports of abuse or neglect, and somebody goes in to investigate, and then there is a determination, and if the child, for the child's safety, needs to be removed, then they're removed. Those folks, only a small percentage of them are social workers.
Right. Well, in this country, it's a bit different. Social services, if you like, which is mainly in our country, local authorities employ social workers, have got the statutory responsibility for child protection. They have a lead responsibility among the four main agencies that are responsible for child protection, which is social services, health, police, and education.
So social workers are involved in all four of those domains?
No, sorry. The social workers are in social services, which is one of the four, but they have a lead responsibility in child protection. These four disciplines share information and, in theory, share decision-making as well.
But in practice?
Well, in practice, sometimes it doesn't work,
I mean, but in practice, does it mean that the social worker ends up making the decision, or is it that the police make the decision?
Well, if you call making a decision actually deciding whether or not that it's a child protection case to start with, I mean, that's a decision. But once it's actually been designated as a case of child protection, then usually now we work together.
I think that's fascinating. So in the UK, social workers are very closely linked to child protection.
Definitely, yeah.
In the United States, we are all mandated reporters. If we suspect abuse or neglect, we have to call Child Protective Services. But the agencies, the child protective agencies, only the people that work there have the legal authority to be able to investigate and make a determination of whether or not there is child abuse or neglect.
That's interesting. Yeah, well, I mean, take a case where, say, a child presents at school with an obvious injury.
Right. Black eye, something like that. Yep.
Yeah, and says, my dad did it. What would happen in that case is that the teachers at the school, they have a designated child protection member of staff at school who's more trained than the rest of the staff who are basically trained. They would, once hearing from the teacher that heard the pupil say that, they would phone the local social work manager in childcare. And that social work manager has a responsibility to convene a strategy meeting. That strategy meeting would, before it happens, it probably could happen the same day, but before it happens, she or he would ask their staff to look into the history of that child's family. So they would phone the doctor, the general practitioner, they would phone anybody, if there were siblings at another school, they'd phone them, or they'd ask the police if there'd been any criminal activity. Domestic violence, as we all know, is a huge factor in a lot of child abuse cases. They would ask for information to be gathered together, and then they would invite health, if there was necessary, a pediatrician who's always trained and on call. They would invite the teaching staff. They would invite somebody from the police child protection unit to come and attend a strategy meeting at which would be chaired by the social work manager. Then they would make a determination between them about what had to happen, how they would deploy their resources. And at that point, obviously you're talking about, do we need immediate protection? Do we need immediate medical examination? What about siblings? If this is a parent who's been alleged to have abused, is there a criminal matter here? Has a criminal activity taken place? Would the police need to take a lead on this? Or, for example, does a medical examination be imminent? What about other siblings? Is the non-abusing parent strong enough to protect when this child goes home tonight, or do we need to take other measures? All these things would have to be taken into account, but that's usually the process. As you can imagine, life's not always straightforward, but that's if you like the regular process that we would look to in a situation like that, which shows the multi-agency approach to it.
So in social work education in the UK, is there education around this multi-agency approach?
Oh, yes, very much so. At the moment, though, we're at a bit of a crossroads. We've got something in this country now that we're piloting called Frontline, and that's focused on child protection, and it's now taking applications from graduates from other professions and fast-tracking them to qualify as social workers. This is a very interesting experiment going on here. They would have like an intensive, 1 or 2 month summer program. Then they would have a couple of years in a local authority, social services, in a very supervised way, an assessed year, almost like, apprenticeship type people, but effectively then they would be considered full-time frontline qualified social workers. So we're trying to address the shortfall in social workers.
And this would be specifically around issues of child protection.
In this case, it is. I mean, I think everybody's waiting to see how this experiment actually folds out, to see whether or not it would be useful for other areas of social work where there are perhaps considerable vacancies.
It's interesting, in the United States, of course, the child protection services or agencies, there's this constant turnover, and so they're constantly looking for folks who are educated and dedicated and want to stick around. And so there's actually money from the federal government available to schools of social work in many states. It's called Title IV-E, and that provides funding for the students. I think it pays tuition, and then it also helps to coordinate internship placements at child protection agencies as a way of funneling in folks into child protection.
There has been criticism from some quarters about the speed in which participants became qualified social workers under this particular scheme.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the whole landscape's changing, Jonathan, in some ways. I mean, there's quite an upsurge now, an almost parallel, I don't want to call it industry, but parallel kind of initiative in safeguarding vulnerable adults. You know, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, all these kind of things. But also with adults, you get financial abuse.
So I want to switch from child welfare to psychotherapy, because one of the things that social workers provide in the United States, they provide more psychotherapeutic services than all other mental health professionals combined. And so most therapists in the United States are clinical social workers. They have a master's degree in social work and a clinical license. And I'm wondering if that is the case in the UK, that therapists tend to be social workers, or if they tend to be something else.
I would say that there are some therapists who have been qualified social workers, but no, the psychotherapy and various other sort of therapeutic branches tend to be standalone.
Standalone how?
Well, in terms of their training, you know, they needn't be social workers first, and a lot of them maybe haven't been social workers before. I'm not sure about what the sources are for them, but social workers in this country tend not to practice psychotherapy.
So if you have a child, we'll go back to child protection, but the kids experienced abuse or neglect, and one of the empirically supported treatments is trauma-focused CBT, TFCBT. Would you have social workers that are trained to deliver trauma-focused CBT?
No.
They would. Okay, so they would refer to somebody else.
They would refer them on, and within the kind of the National Health Service, there are therapists. So we have the National Health Service, which is this the free at the point of contact. Which wouldn't cost anybody anything. But we also have backups. Like I'm a trustee myself of a charity that provides psychotherapeutic support for victims of sexual abuse. So men, women, and children, which is quite unusual. It's usually sort of one or the other,
Yeah.
But in this case, and we get referrals from the health service or from general practitioners, GP, or from perhaps, I don't know, adolescent mental health services within the health service itself, or hospitals, but also obviously from social workers. Who refer cases to us. So they would either refer them through their doctor, they would get referred to the provision within the National Health Service, the sort of psychotherapeutic provision, or they would maybe get picked up by some of these accredited but voluntary sector organizations like the one I'm a trustee of.
Now, when you say trustee, what does that mean?
I'm a charity trustee. Every charity in this country has to have a governance in which it's overseen by a board of trustees.
Oh, okay. All right.
And I'm one of the board, but it's a voluntary arrangement because it's a charity, so I do that as a voluntary thing.
Okay. I have one other question. Well, I have 1,000 questions, but for this interview, when people think about social work, when the general public thinks about social work in the UK, what are the stereotypes of a social worker?
In the main, the general public thinks of social work to do with children. In the main, and to do with child protection, because they're the ones that are the more melodramatic, that hit the headlines and all that kind of thing. And social workers are always involved. And it tends to be quite pejorative. And I'm fascinated by this myself, because we've been fighting a fight now for a long time, since about 1970, when we pulled all the different disciplines together, and the British Association of Social Workers came together then as a more unified kind of organization. But,
and you used to be the head of that organization, right?
Yes, yeah. I used to be the national chairman. So you call it president in America. But what I'm going to say was that the media have always been a very kind of rough, blaming media at one end of it. And when children get hurt or die or something like that, and social workers were involved, there's always looking for blame. People forget it's usually parents that kill children. Mm-hmm. It's always for some reason social workers. Although at any one time in England anyway, there are about 40,000 children who are subject of at-risk plans. In other words, considered to be at risk from their parents. So, I suppose that's about the same as the States if you extrapolate up the kind of the national population. But effectively, it's usually, I think, in the media, we've got a very difficult image, which we're trying to do. I've got a great sort of personal view of this, but I don't know, there's no academic thing to back it up. But I always think that since the British Empire, if you know what I mean, like back in Victorian days and, covered sort of half the globe,
the sun never sets.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that Britain was the sort of the biggest sort of trading nation and was at war with everybody and sent a gunboat. If you sneezed on Britain, they sent a gunboat, that kind of thing. And now, of course, we don't. We're nothing like as powerful as that, and thank God for it. But effectively, I think that people never recognize the fact that we had deprivation, we have poverty, we have injustice, we have child abuse, we have all the various things in this country that most Western industrialized countries have. We have an underbelly. And it's difficult for this population, I think, in its genes to accept that. And so they tend to try and sweep it under the carpet. And so in sweeping it under the carpet, those that are charged to work with them, those that are charged to be the safety net, those that are charged to actually support the vulnerable tend to tried to be swept under the carpet with them as well, because otherwise they'd have to acknowledge they exist.
Wow. That's an interesting hypothesis.
That's more of a kind of, you've got to have a look at a couple of hundred years of history for that one. But at the end of the day, I just think we're also a very young profession. And I think it was the same in the States. Remember with medicine, about a couple of hundred years ago, doctors, right, were the lowest of the low. They were quacks. They were snake oil salesmen. They were, surgeons in this country are called Mr. because the term doctor was so pejorative that they refused to be called doctor, so they called themselves Mr. And that's taken a long time. And now they're near the top of the tree in terms of the profession. My message, if you like, to social work is, okay, look, we're, let's look at ourselves as being, although we're 100 or 200 years old in real terms, we're actually only about 40 to 50 years old in professional terms. So sadly, you guys are just the frontiersmen. Suddenly you guys are, it's our next generation of social workers that will get the respect they properly deserve.
David, this is great. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us about social work in the UK and to use your insight, both as somebody that sort of oversaw this national organization in the UK, but also somebody who's spent time in the United States, to provide this perspective. I found it fascinating. So thank you so much.
You're very, very welcome, Jonathan. I hope we can do it again. And it was nice of you to come on my podcast as well. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I loved being on your podcast. I'd be happy to do it again.
Sure. Take care.
I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.